Hi everybody and welcome to today's assembly, the start of another week. I hope you had a really good week last week and I've been really impressed. I've been into lots of classes across the school last week and I've been watching how you've been doing, how you've settled back in after our long periods of lockdown and where some of us have been in school and some haven't. And I've been really impressed by the responsibility that you've shown in your learning behaviours. As I've watched you in your learning, that you've been listening, you've been really thinking, sometimes about using different words, different vocabulary, sometimes about phonics and the sounds you need to make a word, sometimes about maths problems and how to solve those challenges. But you've been doing some really deep thinking. You've been asking some really sensible and thoughtful questions that have helped you to try and work out the answers or solve those challenges. You've been talking to friends about your ideas, sharing your ideas, testing them out before you shared them with the class and the grown-ups in the class. You've been looking at the person who's speaking so that the grown-ups and the other people within the groups and class that you work in know that you're ready to be learning. And all of those things mean that they're helping you to make really good progress in your learning. And I've been really impressed, as I say, as I've gone around the school and watched this week just how well you are doing with that. And hopefully we'll be making some really good progress. And you've taken the responsibility for yourselves. And our value for this half term, as you know, is responsibility. And responsibility, although we're taking that responsibility for ourselves with our learning behaviours, responsibility is such a big thing. And if you look at our posters around the school, it talks about making the right choices, saying the right things, being responsible for what you say, and not just what you say, but how you speak and how you say things. About joining in and participating. You take responsibility for that, even when sometimes that learning can be really tricky, or it can be tricky to solve an argument on the playground. And you're taking that responsibility to take care of others. So that responsibility value is huge, and it's really hard for us to be doing it all the time. But you've been doing a great job, and I've noticed around school this week, as I've walked around the corridors or through the dining room, I've seen people taking responsibility, not just for themselves, but for other people too. And maybe doing things that weren't necessarily things that they had caused. So somebody, as I walked past down through the Key Stage 2 corridor, I saw somebody picking up other people's coats and hanging them up on the pegs, just so they didn't get trodden on. They didn't need to do that, but they took that responsibility to do it. When I went into the dining hall, somebody had left a fork on the floor. The dinner ladies would have cleared that up at the end of the lunchtime, or maybe picked it up during the lunchtime, but I noticed somebody pick it up and go and put it into the cutlery holder ready for washing. They didn't need to do that, but it was really, taking that responsibility to do it. So nobody stood on it, nobody hurt their foot, nobody slipped. They took that responsibility for taking care and looking after others. And I've watched people as well on the playground bringing things in, picking things up on the way back in after their playtime. Some of the play equipment that other people may have dropped, some people picking it up and bringing it in to their classes so that that it can be put away safely. They didn't need to, they weren't playing with it. It wasn't necessarily their responsibility, but they took responsibility. And that's really important, and that makes such a difference. And we talk about responsibility lots, about our own responsibility for our own behaviours, about what we do and say, our own choices, but our responsibility in the wider school, that how can we make a difference to what goes on in our school? How can we make a difference to making our school such a great school? Last week, I found that I was in the dining room and I found a small little dice that somebody had left in there. One of those little green ones with the numbers 1 to 20 on. And I know they're quite expensive, those. It's not a big thing. And I picked it up off the floor and I could have just put it on the side because I didn't know where it had come from, which classroom or who had left it there. But I took the responsibility to go and find out. And I went around to one of the classes and I said, "Is this? Do you use these die?" And the grown-up I spoke to said, "No, they're not for us. Try down in year 6." And I went down to one of the year 5, 6 classes and found there it was. I said to one of the grown-ups, I don't know if it had come from that classroom, but it went back into their pot so it could be used. I took the responsibility to pick that up, make sure that it didn't just get swept up with the rubbish, it didn't just get chucked out or go missing. I put it back so it could be used by people when they're doing their maths work. So it's that responsibility that makes a difference. And I'm going to tell you a story today about somebody who didn't perhaps take the responsibility for their actions that they should do. And in fact, this story, I'm going to just share my screen, comes from Australia. And it's an Australian tale based way out in the outback. And it's a story about how the koala bear became the koala bear. And there's a picture of one on the screen. You may have seen them before. They live up trees, munching on leaves. But this is an Australian tale based in the outback. And the story is about a little boy. And his name was Koala. And Koala didn't have a mum or a dad. And he lived on his own and spent most of his time living up in a leafy tree. He lived right out in the outback where it was really dry and dusty and the sun beat down onto the ground and it was really hot, which caused lots of problems. And out in the outback, they didn't have taps and that we could just turn on like we do and get water and have a drink. The people in the village where he lived had to go each day down to the watering hole with carrying buckets and bags that held water. They would fill them up in the watering hole and then they would trudge back with the heavy weight of the buckets full of water and the bags full of water. And they would put them down in the village under the eucalyptus tree so that it kept them cool. Well, one really hot summer, the sun was blistering down day after day. There hadn't been rain for a long, long time. And the water hole where the villagers used to go and collect their water from was getting smaller and smaller and smaller as the hot sun dried it up. And before long, the water had vanished. It had evaporated into the air, and all that was left was the cracked mud that was baked hard. Well, the villagers were worried. Where on earth were they going to get their water from now? Because they needed water to survive. So they held a village meeting. Everybody was there, including Koala. They decided at the meeting that the following morning they would take as many buckets and as many bags to fill with water as they could, and they would go and track down the next nearest watering hole where they could find some. And that's exactly what they did. The next morning, before the sun rose too high and started to really heat up, they carried all the bags and the buckets And all the villagers started to leave the village in a line of walking in a line down to try and find a watering hole where they could bring back the water. Well, Koala was up his tree. A couple of the elder people in the tribe shouted up to him, "Koala, you need to come and help. You need to come and help collect the water. We will all be thirsty." Well, Koala looked down from his tree and said, "Oh, I wish I could, but I've got a really sore ankle. I just couldn't walk that far, and I certainly couldn't carry any buckets or bags of water." And off the villagers went. Well, Koala wasn't telling the truth. His ankle was fine. He just couldn't be bothered. He didn't want to take responsibility for helping. So that day was very quiet in the village until later, much later in the day, because the watering hole was a long, long walk. And the villagers slowly came back, trudging up the hill to the village, carrying their buckets and their bags of water, which they took into the village and placed under one of the trees. And they placed it under the trees to keep it in the shade so that it stayed cool. They drank some of their water, and that night they all went to bed feeling much, much better. But the villagers wouldn't let Koala have any. If you hadn't come and help, if you had chosen not to help, then you can't have some of our water. Well, the next morning, when the villagers woke, they collected the water the day before. This time, it was time to go and collect the food from the field or from where they were growing some of the crops, and from the animal traps. They went out to search for food to bring back to the village. When everybody had left and the village was quiet, Koala peeked out from up his tree. He could see everybody had gone. He went around the village looking for the water, where they put it. And then he found it there under the tree in the shade, still nice and cool because it had been cooled down during the night. Well, Koala was so thirsty because he hadn't had any water the night before. He drank and he drank and he drank. And then he drank some more. And he ended up being so full. His tummy had swollen and he felt quite uncomfortable, but he wasn't thirsty. What he hadn't realised was how much water he had drunk, and there was not going to be enough there for all of the villagers. Koala climbed back up into the tree and hid amongst the leaves. The villagers came back from their day of hunting and gathering their crops, tired, hungry, and thirsty. The villagers put the crops down and all their catch down. They went over to where the tree was to get the water so they could all refresh themselves with a nice cool drink, only to see that most of the water they had collected had vanished. "Where's it gone?" they cried. "Who's drunk our water?" shouted someone. "I know," said the chief's wife. "I know who's done it." And they all looked at her. "It's that boy up the tree. It's Koala. He has drunk our water." Well, they were so angry. Some of the younger men in the village started to climb the tree, shouting and screaming at Koala. "How dare he take our water? He wasn't allowed to their water. He didn't come and help collect it. He didn't take any responsibility for the food or for the water being collected." And as they got closer and closer up the tree trunk towards Koala, he started to jump around. He started to shout and scream and started to cry. And a strange thing happened. His body started to change. You could see on his arms and on his legs and then on his chest and his back some thin grey fur growing. And it was getting thicker and thicker. His nose changed from a nose like ours to a black shiny button. And his eyes became narrower and thinner and tinier and blacker. And before long, up in the tree was no longer a boy shouting and screaming and crying, but a bear. And they called him the Koala bear. And over time, that changed because the name shortened. Instead of being Koala, they called him the Koala bear. And that is the story about how the koala bear came to be a koala bear. And it is an Australian tale, but I think it reminds us very much that we all need to take responsibility for not just looking after ourselves, but helping to look after others. And if we take that responsibility, we'll all be better off for it. So have a really good week this week. Take care, work hard, keep taking that responsibility for your behaviour, whether you're in a classroom, moving around the school, on the playground, in the dining hall, on the way to school, or on the way back. Make those good choices. Have a good week.